Air Iran Airbus flying between Bandar Abbas and Dubai, and the US Navy shot it down, and then the US Navy claims it was a mistake, and they apologized, but retaliation, he said, had to be done. How does retaliation happen in this part of the world or in the Middle East? He said they obviously had to ask help from another country, a friendly service, so they subcontracted the retaliation to one of the Syrian intelligence services. And we all know there are about 14 intelligence services in Syria, so I don't know which one. And they then subcontracted to our own intelligence service.
If it had been the case that Syria was guilty of responsibility for Lockerbie, that would have been very embarrassing at the time when Syria became an important ally of the United Nations forces, America, Britain, France, and the other countries which took part in the Iraq War at the beginning of the 90s.
The West wasn't looking for other trails in the obscure world of terrorist networks and secret services. It had the perfect fall guy in the blustering Colonel Gaddafi.
The international community is sending two clear signals. First,
this time, it was not bombs, but international sanctions that were to hit Tripoli. Libya was required to accept responsibility for the bombings and to turn in the agents responsible. Western diplomats believed that a drastic embargo would be enough to bring Gaddafi down. In 1993, Gaddafi celebrated his 24th year in power. The erstwhile revolutionary was now 50. Flanked by the few national leaders who were still willing to be seen with him, he pointed the finger at his old enemies, Britain, America, and France, to explain the position Libya now found itself in.
باعت نفسها هذا الشيطان واعتقدوا أن الشيطان سيبقى دائما، لكن نقول أن الشيطان سيهزم في النهاية وسينتحر الشيطان.
But for now, Gaddafi was the one in danger. He was a pariah, leader of a country that was cut off from the rest of the world by an embargo on air traffic and weapons sales, and above all, by a boycott of its oil, Libya's only source of revenue. With the nation bankrupt, Gaddafi faced dissent from within the regime. There were several attempted coups.
For Gaddafi, there's one important thing for him: being in charge, being in power. Because if he loses his power, he's finished. And when I say finished, finished literally. So we are talking about someone who would do anything in order to stay alive, in order to survive.
To survive, Gaddafi needed money, diplomatic support, and oil exports. In short, he needed the West, especially the United States, the sole superpower of the post-Cold War world. It was a matter of survival, for in the vast Libyan desert, Gaddafi had found another formidable enemy. Armed Islamist groups with ties to Al-Qaeda were trying to oust his weakening secular regime. Like much of the rest of the Arab world, Libya faced the challenge of Islamism, which fed on economic stagnation and dictatorship. The Colonel and the United States now had a common enemy. So he gave an interview to a journalist known to have ties with US intelligence agencies.
He said, you know, I want to work with the CIA. He said, I'm threatened by Muslim extremism, Islamist extremism, especially in the eastern part of my country, and I would like to cooperate with the CIA. And would you pass this message on? Which I did. Well, I called my friend Jim Woolsey, who was then head of the CIA. I knew him when he was negotiating the MBFR treaty with the Russians in Vienna. So I called him and I told him what had happened. He said, do you mind being debriefed by our experts? I said, no, of course not. So we met at the agency. There was about 14 people around the table. And when I told them that he was anxious to cooperate with the CIA, somebody said, do you trust him? I said, of course you don't trust him. Nobody trusts him. But if I were you, I'm not CIA, but if I were you, I'd test him.
You know, I don't really remember exactly when this offer was made. It was probably there, but we didn't take it very seriously. Again, as time went on, we became more concerned about the threat from Al-Qaeda.
Despite this non-response, Gaddafi approached the White House to open negotiations on Lockerbie.
You know, it was like he was knocking on every door and trying to see whether there was any window that was unlocked. And you know, rarely would a week pass in those days, in those first 2 years that I was in the White House, when there wasn't somebody, a friend, usually a friend of the president's, from Arkansas, who was calling up and saying, you know, I've got a message from Gaddafi. He also used foreign leaders. At the beginning of an administration, a lot of our Arab allies come to visit. There were those various initiatives. They didn't seem to us to be serious.
Finding the doors and windows closed, the Libyans tried the chimney. They approached Washington lobbyists, including several who had been members of President Reagan's old team. Some agreed to plead Libya's case. Among them was Abe Sofair, one of the men behind the 1986 air raid on Libya.
Well, it was very clear why they chose me. They told me why. They basically said, we believe that the American people and the American government will trust you. They know that you bombed Libya, that you were part of the team that bombed Libya, and therefore you're the right guy. I said, the only way I would be willing to accept a representation of Libya is if you told me ahead of time that the purpose of the negotiation would be to satisfy the UN resolutions. And so then it came back, the answer came back, yes, we would.
In a Geneva hotel known for its discretion, Sofair had several meetings with Libyan officials.
When I met them in Geneva, and I met the head of intelligence, their intelligence service, I was even surprised at how clearly they felt that they were suffering as a result of the sanctions. In a more informal discussions, it was always about what do we need to do? You know, how do I establish a relationship with the intelligence service of the United States? How do we establish commerce again? What are the steps that we need to take? And of course, I told them the first thing you need to do is settle these resolutions.
Sofair informed his former colleagues that the Libyans were ready to agree to all the UN demands.
People I spoke to said, number one, they'll never do it. Number two, they're full of it. They're just misleading you. And number three, if you're right, we won't agree to it.
our view of it at the beginning of the administration was that Gaddafi was essentially in a box. He was under sanctions, UN sanctions. He wasn't causing us any serious problems, and that it was fine to basically leave him there.
It was check, almost checkmate. On the 10th anniversary of the 1986 air raid, Gaddafi fell back on his usual theatrics.
يعني بعد المذبحة هذه ما زالوا يتكلموا عن لوكربي.
After this massacre, they talk about Lockerbie.
المفروض تخجل ما عادش تتكلم عن ليبيا.
America should be ashamed of Libya. America should not talk about Libya.
بعد هذه المذبحة نفاجأ بأن ليبيا متهمة مرة أخرى بلوكربي.
After such genocide or massacre, we talk about, we find out that Libya is being accused again of Lockerbie.
But Gaddafi still had one more card to play, and it was an ace. He asked the American oil companies in Libya to send him an emissary. They sent a former ambassador who was well versed in difficult negotiations.
Well, my personal belief after 38 years as a diplomat was that we should never break communications with anyone. We should always be talking. And I even told Gaddafi this. I said that during the Second World War in Bern, Switzerland, we were talking to the Nazis